However, despite the efforts and improvements in economic theory and a vast amount of empirical evidence either supporting or supporting some positive role of fiscal policy on economic performance, the role of fiscal policy remained controversial, and the theory, neither the theory or the empirical analysis helped to settle the disputes whether there is some place for fiscal policy or not. It has been very apparent in times of the Great Recession, which started with the financial crisis in 2007 and then moved into full-fledged recession in 2008, and it's been the largest that time largest decrease in the U.S. economic activity since the Great Depression. The U.S. government reacted and prepared the so-called large fiscal stimulus called American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARRA, and a new elected president, Barack Obama, tried to push this package of fiscal stimulus through the Congress. After a long discussion, it's been passed by the Congress, 244 in favor, 188 against, but and then again supported in the Senate at the end of February. The acceptance of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act led to a relatively strong counteraction or protests of leading economists in the US. So about 200 US economists at that time signed a letter against the ARRA plan, including some Nobel laureates, Edward Prescott, Vernon Smith, James Buchanan, and others. It's been published in the leading newspapers like Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and its preparation was funded by the conservative Cato Institute. And the economists there in the letter denied the statement by President Obama that there was no disagreement that we need action by our government, a recovery plan that will help to jumpstart the economy. Rather, the signers believed that to improve the economy, the policymakers should focus on reforms that remove the impediments to work, saving, investment, and production, lower tax rates, and reduce the burden of the government. And they believe that these are the best ways of using fiscal policy to boost the economic growth. If we read this, we can trace there the legacy of the American liquidationist theories quite well there. However, the letter of those 200 economists wasn't the only one. Just shortly after, there's been another letter to Congress signed by another 200 economists. Actually, there were some economists who signed both of those letters, one against and also the one in favor of the ARRA. And several Nobel laureates were on board as well, such as Kenneth Arrow and others. So like Paul Samuelson and Robert Solon. So this is perhaps best illustration that that when fiscal stimulus in times when the interest rates gradually approach to zero, so there was been almost no scope for conventional monetary policy. Then the fiscal stimulus remained as a viable option, and it's been by a large part of the community rejected, and by a large part of the community widely advocated. Then the Chicago University-based IGM Forum poll among the leading economists reported that actually about 80% of leading economists agreed that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act actually brought down the unemployment at the end in comparison with the no stimulus scenario. And also 46% supported the view that the benefits of the stimulus outweighed the costs. Later on, the share of the supporters gradually increased, but still there is no wide agreement whether it contributed positively to recovery starkly or not that much. Obviously, it is also connected with the composition of the fiscal stimulus, because many measures on the spending side were at the end eliminated to facilitate passing the stimulus plan through the Congress and also through the Senate. We might then ask, why are so many economists skeptical to the potential of fiscal policy to stabilize the economy? There are several reasons for that, from practical reasons to ideology. And it depends on what the people are exacerbating, or where they are stressing, where they are putting the main importance. From the practical reasons, it's mainly about implementation lags, that it often takes time when it takes a lot of time between there is a decision on a governmental level about that there is a need for fiscal stimulus, then it takes time until it is being passed through the parliament, and then it has to be implemented by the bureaucracy. So there is quite a lengthy delay. The other problem associated with fiscal policy, as viewed by many, is that the measures by fiscal policy might not be optimal, because the political process is connected with plenty of rent-seeking activities, and thus it might not be equally good for all. There are also some theoretical reasons why fiscal policy is not accepted universally as a relevant tool for economic policy, and those reasons stem from the theoretical implications of the new Keynesian DSG model. So the new Keynesian DSG model still assumes that crowding out holds. That means every dollar spent by or every euro spent by the government says the euro which is not being spent by the private sector. Also, the government expenditures are not expected to have positive effects on the economy, so they usually do not enter the utility functions and profit functions of households and firms. And also, it is assumed by most of the model the models are constructed on such micro foundations which imply the so-called Barrow-Ricardian equivalence. The Barrow-Ricardian equivalence states that there is no difference whether the government finances the additional spendings via debt expansion or via tax increases. Why? Because when agents have rational expectations, then even if the government spendings, so the new spendings, are financed by their debt creation, they know that they will have to pay for that somewhere in the future. And so they adjust their consumption accordingly, as if there is no expansion at all. There's this huge discussion. There was a huge discussion whether the concerns about the fiscal stimulus are really relevant, whether the Barrow-Ricardian equivalence can be accepted or not, and there's no agreement. So, but what can be said for sure is that it is really driven by the assumption of rational expectations, which implies very high degree of consumption smoothing. That means very high attempts of households to smooth the consumption over time to offset much of the fluctuations either in the economy or in government expenditures or in whatever. There's another interesting implication of the Barrow-Ricardian equivalence, besides the fact that the households won't just react positively on an increase in government spending, and the aggregate consumption might remain very similar or even can be lowered. And that's the idea of a so-called expansionary fiscal consolidation. Traditionally, fiscal consolidation, that means cutting government expenditures or raising taxes, was believed to be associated with restriction on economic activity. That means on decrease of the overall economic activity. However, if Barrow-Ricardian equivalence holds, then if people change their expectations and believe that the public debt will decrease, then it is said that they might also assume that the taxes in the future could be lower, And via fiscal consolidation and promise of a smaller debt in the future, they might actually increase their spending because of higher confidence. And this idea sounds appealing as well. Similarly, as the idea that one can stabilize the output just via stabilization of inflation, and the idea of a possibility of expansionary fiscal consolidation shaped the response to the Great Recession, in particular in Europe. There are several readings which I recommend for a discussion on the role of fiscal policy in current mainstream. The first is a pre-crisis paper by Alan Blinder, the case against discretionary fiscal policy, very entertaining piece. And then two pieces on expansionary fiscal consolidation. One already quite an old contribution by Francesco Giavazzi and Marco Pagano, who just started with who started with this who introduced the possibility of expansionary fiscal consolidations already in 1990, and then Alberto Alvesina's contribution, very quoted and influential paper, Fiscal Adjustments: Lessons from the Recent History. A paper that shaped the actual policy making in Europe Europe a lot. Nevertheless, it needs to be said that the outcomes of fiscal consolidations in Europe were not very positive. First, even though in Europe the attempts to fiscal stimulus were reverted with the hope that fiscal consolidations will help as well, or perhaps maybe even more, and also because of concerns that the debt which increased due to the crisis and due to the fiscal stimulus might not be sustainable in the future. Furthermore, the architecture of the Eurozone did not allow for persistency in fiscal impulse, because in a Eurozone, the ECB cannot serve as a lender of last resort to the government, and wasn't allowed to intervene on government bond markets. And the resistance to change this setting, which lasted more than 3 years, led to fiscal led to sharp fiscal consolidations in the European Union in the midst of the crisis. You can see the outcomes on the plot. The red line represents the gross domestic product of the United States. The green line of the United Kingdom, which pursued first fiscal expansion, but then some fiscal consolidation, but not that much dramatic as in other European countries. And the blue line is the blue line represents the euro area. And you can see that that euro area had by far the worst performance in comparison with United Kingdom and in United States. And the fiscal consolidation actually led to a so-called double dip recession, with a second recession shortly after, shortly after the first one. So there's been just a mild recovery after 2008, but replaced by another recession within recession again. And it took much longer to the European Union, to the euro area, until it reached pre-crisis levels of a GDP in comparison with, with the US and with the United Kingdom. It needs to be said that even the year 2015, when the pre-crisis level has been achieved for the euro area as a whole, is not associated with the return to pre-crisis level in all European area countries. So, conclusion and assessment. The Great Recession revealed several weaknesses in the mainstream new Keynesian TSG models. First, in terms of financial stability, and second, in terms of the hopes that fiscal consolidations can bring large gains in terms of macroeconomic performance. And let me just say that in 2008-2009, the economists were very often criticized for not being able to predict the crisis of 2008. Actually, just few of them, few economists saw the storm coming. However, for me, quite surprisingly, fewer asked why economists were unable to reach a consensus on an appropriate crisis response, because predicting recession is really a very hard job, but it's by large unpredictable event. But not having a consensus about what shall be done when there is a recession is perhaps even bigger problem of the, or was perhaps a bigger problem of the recession or of the profession that time. So, like in the 1970s, the Great Recession revealed some weak points of the theory, which are linked with the key building blocks of those models, such as with the belief in efficient market hypothesis, and also in a belief that rational expectations are really driving the decisions of households and firms to that large extent as expected in the models. So, like in the 1970s, it became apparent that the policy guidance based on models, based on empirical relationships such as the Phillips curve, is perhaps not not reliable anymore, and not reliable enough, and should be replaced. Something similar happened after 2008, when it became apparent that the over-reliance on rational expectations led to such failures. And the challenges and the reactions in the profession will be subject of the following sessions. And when seeing the policy response to the COVID crisis, it is quite evident that the challenges and that the failures of the Great Recession were addressed, at least to some extent, by the profession in the decade after the Great Recession. Thank you for your attention.